Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to show you a simple example of how academics use language to deceive about climate. The Washington Post says the world is going to end in less than 12 years due to climate change. And they get their information from academics like the University of Copenhagen. This is an incredibly deceptive article. Let's read through it and discuss. Rise in temperatures and CO2 follow each other closely in climate change. The greatest climate change the world has seen in the last 100,000 years was the transition from the Ice Age to the warm interglacial period. New research from the Niels Bohr Institute at the University of Copenhagen indicates that, contrary to previous opinion, the rise in temperature and the rise in atmospheric CO2 follow each other very closely in terms of time. The results have been published in the scientific journal Climate of the Past. In the warmer climate, the atmospheric content of CO2 is naturally higher. The gas CO2, carbon dioxide, is a greenhouse gas that absorbs heat radiation from the Earth and thus keeps the Earth warm. In the shift between ice ages and interglacial periods, the atmospheric content of CO2 helps to intensify the natural climate variations. It had previously been thought that as the temperature began to rise at the end of the Ice Age, approximately 19,000 years ago, an increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere followed with a delay of up to 1,000 years. Our analyses of ice cores from the ice sheet in Antarctica show that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere follows the rise in Antarctic temperatures very closely and is staggered by a few hundred years at most, explains Sune Olander Rasmussen, Associate Professor and Center Coordinator at the Center for Ice and Climate at the Niels Bohr Institute at the University of Copenhagen. My first comment is that there's nothing wrong with the underlying scientific research. It all sounds correct. The problem is the language being used. Rasmussen said very clearly, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere follows the rise in Antarctic temperatures. Now let's compare that to the headline. It says rise in temperatures and CO2 follow each other closely in climate change. Things don't follow each other. You have a leader in front and a follower behind. What the headline is describing is a dog chasing its tail. The dog's head is in front of the tail, and the tail is in front of the head. CO2 is the cart, and temperature is the horse. The cart does not pull the horse. Let's look at Rasmussen's statement once again. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere follows the rise in temperature. Now let's look at the Antarctic ice cores, which Rasmussen is referring to. This graph shows Antarctic temperature and CO2 concentration over the last 450,000 years. The blue line is temperature variation and the red line is CO2 concentration. You can see that they parallel each other very closely. When temperature goes up, CO2 goes up, and when temperature goes down, CO2 goes down with it. The reason why this occurs is very simple. Warm water can't hold as much carbon dioxide as cold water. A warm beer will get very foamy because it's outgassing carbon dioxide. On the other hand, cold beer is less foamy because more of the carbon dioxide remains dissolved in the beer. So at the end of the last ice age 20,000 years ago, when temperatures started to rise due to changes in orbital cycles, carbon dioxide started to rise too. As the oceans warmed, they outgassed carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and CO2 levels went up. A misunderstanding of this relationship has been at the center of climate alarmism from day one. The bulk of climate literature is based around the idea that carbon dioxide drives changes in temperatures, when in fact the relationship is the exact opposite. I'm not saying something radical here. This is exactly what's said in the University of Copenhagen paper. Again, the paper said, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere follows the rise in Antarctic temperatures. The deception is so bad that Nobel laureate Al Gore's working associate Laurie David actually reversed the relationship in a children's textbook. They lied to children by reversing the x-axis and making it look like carbon dioxide drove temperature, even though the relationship is the exact opposite. This sort of deception in the schools has led to frightened children like Greta Thunberg. Now let's look at the real ice core graphs again. These graphs show us something extremely important. Ice ages begin when carbon dioxide levels are at a maximum, and ice ages end when carbon dioxide levels are at a minimum. If CO2 was the driver of climate, this relationship would be the exact opposite. If climate alarmist theory was correct, ice ages would begin when CO2 was low and they would end when CO2 was high. But the exact opposite is the real relationship. The whole basis of climate alarmism and much of modern climate science is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of science. Now let's look at one more very important thing which these graphs show us. The graph shows regular swings in temperature of about 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. And these are associated with relatively small swings in carbon dioxide of only about 100 parts per million. Not even the most radical climate alarmist would try to claim that a 100 part per million swing in carbon dioxide would produce a 10°C swing in temperatures. The largest temperature rise which you could possibly account for as being due to the 100 part per million increase in CO2 would be about 1 degree Celsius. That would mean that at least 90% of the warming would have to be due to something other than carbon dioxide. These graphs show definitively that carbon dioxide is not driving the climate. Yet the bulk of climate literature is based on the assumption that carbon dioxide does drive the climate. It's an entire field of completely useless junk science. It's pretty clear that politicians who pimp global warming and fear about sea level rise don't actually believe it themselves. Barack Obama just bought a $15 million house on the beach in Massachusetts. And the most expensive home in Florida history just sold for $111 million on the beach in Palm Beach. If the world's going to end in 11 years, it'll be due to ignorance and superstition, not carbon dioxide. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.